lecture at the Library of Congress. Really glad you all are here. I'm thrilled that Ian McEwan is here, author of 17, maybe 18 books now? Who knows?
No idea.
So we're going to talk for a little while, but we want you to be thinking of your questions because we'll give some time for you all to ask them. And I think we're going to start with a short reading from Ian, and then we'll take some.
So I'm going to read something I've never read before from this novel. I generally begin at the beginning because it needs no introduction. This one needs a tiny one, just to say that like all writers of fiction, inevitably one is engaged with chance, accident, and contingency. It's always fascinated me. A biologist once told me, when we were talking about contingency in life and the nature of the accidental, that if my parents had made love 5 seconds earlier, I wouldn't be here. I would be someone else. Such is the extraordinary mathematical magic of recombination in two sets of genes. So here, my main character, my principal person, Roland Baines, is speculating about how he met his wife, the German Elisa Eberhard. So how did Berlin and the renowned Elisa Eberhard come into his life? In settled, expansive mood, Roland occasionally reflected on the events and accidents, personal and global, minuscule and momentous, that had formed and determined his existence. His case was not special. All fates are similarly constituted. Nothing forces public events on private lives like a war. If Hitler had not invaded Poland and so diverted Private Baines's Scottish division from its planned tour of duty in Egypt to northern France, then to Dunkirk and his serious leg injuries, he would never have been designated unfit for combat and posted to Aldershot to encounter Rosalind in 1945. And Roland would not exist. If the young Jane Farmer had done as she was asked and popped across the Alps for Cyril Connolly in his bid to improve the nation's post-war diet, Elisa would not exist. Commonplace and wondrous. In the early 30s, have I been deactivated? In the early 30s, if Private Baines had not taken up the mouth organ, he might not have been so keen for his son to take piano lessons to enhance his personal popularity. And then, if Khrushchev had not placed nuclear missiles on Cuba and Kennedy had not ordered a naval blockade of the island, Roland would not have biked to Irwin, to Miriam Cornell's cottage that Sunday morning, and their affair, the unicorn, would have remained chained in its enclosure. And Roland would have passed his public exams and gone to university to study literature and languages. Then he would not have drifted for more than a decade, successfully driving his ex-piano teacher from his thoughts to become, in his late 20s, an ardent autodidact. He would not have taken German conversations lessons in 1977 at the Goethe Institute in South Kensington with Elisa Eberhard. And then their son Lawrence would not exist. Roland arrived for his first lesson and the conversation had already started. There were 5 others in the group, 2 women, 3 men. They sat on folding chairs in a horseshoe facing her. She nodded curtly at Roland as he took his seat. He had picked up enough German at school to have entered himself in the low intermediate class. The teacher's English was perfect, barely a trace of an accent. Her teaching style was precise, exacting, with a touch of impatience. She made sure everybody spoke in turn. She was compact and energetic, unusually pale with extremely dark eyes that were not made up. She had an interesting habit of glancing away to her right and upwards whenever she gathered her thoughts. There was something dangerous or unruly in her manner, Roland decided. Immediately, he felt himself to be in competition with the 3 men. The conversation was about children on holiday, and now her gaze was on him in an intense look of expectation. He had not been listening closely, but he understood he was supposed to say something like, "It's my turn." He said, "Ich bin dran." "Sehr gut, aber," she glanced down at her list of names, "Roland, with the new toys." He had missed that part. He hesitated. His heart had made a pleasant lurch at her very good, and he had come to learn, but he wanted to show off what he knew. Needing to impress her, to show her he was above the rest, he proceeded with caution. "Ich bin an die Reihe mit dem neuen Spielzeug." Her correction was patient. Her enunciation was exaggerated for the benefit of a dimwit. "Ich bin an der Reihe mit dem neuen Spielzeug." "Ah, of course. Genau. Oh, yes, sorry. Genau." She moved on. The toys were boring, the day was sunny, the children were hungry, they liked fruit. They also liked swimming, especially when it was raining. When she came back to Roland, he made 3 basic errors in one sentence. She corrected him briskly, and the class ended. 2 weeks later, at the end of the 3rd lesson, someone asked her in faltering German to say a little about herself. Roland listened carefully. She spoke slowly for their benefit. They learned that she was 29, had been born in Bavaria to an English mother and German father, but she grew up in the north, not so far from Hanover. She had just completed her MA at King's College London. She liked hiking, movies, and cooking, and something else he didn't catch. She would be married next spring. Her fiancé was a trumpet player. The class, minus Roland, murmured its approval. Then one of the women asked the teacher to tell them her greatest ambition. They had just been practicing that word, der Ehrgeiz. Miss Eberhardt told them without hesitation that her ambition was to be the greatest novelist of her generation, if not of Europe. She said it with an ironic smile. Thank you.
That's great. So that passage is about how Roland and Alyssa met. Thank you. But it's not giving anything away for us to explain.
No, you give everything away. Sorry.
Okay.
I really don't.
For you to explain to the audience what happens near the beginning of the novel with Alyssa and sort of a sudden rupture. What happens and?
Yep. So Roland, who's been a very restless young man, which partly has its roots in the fact that he was sexually groomed and then enters into an affair with his piano teacher at boarding school between the ages of 14 and 16. And then he runs away from that. Finally, he falls in love and marries a young German woman. They have a child, a boy called Lawrence. And when Lawrence is 7 months old, and I should say they're living in a rather squalid 2-up, 2-down house in South London, which neither of them ever has the patience or the energy left over after looking after a baby to tidy up. So the place is crammed with junk, and they just about manage, like many of us do in those first extraordinary months with a first child. Second was always curiously easier, I don't know why. And second children, of course, are famously more relaxed. Then one day, she simply vanishes. She leaves a loving note on the pillow. She says she loves him, but she cannot tolerate. This life was not for her. It's left not on the kitchen table, which is the conventional thing, but on a pillow on the bed. And as he ruminates, like a hotel's bitter chocolate on the pillow. And I am allowed to tell you, I guess, that 3 years later, it's the fall of the Berlin Wall. He goes across on the 10th of November, and in the surging crowds, he's sort of looking out for her. He has every reason to think that she'd be there. And indeed, they meet. He's full of fury and dismay still 3 years on that They've been deserted. He has no idea where she is, apart from some initial postcards from southern Germany, but then she's just vanished. Anyway, they meet. They have a somewhat bitter exchange in an alleyway in the newly accessible East Berlin. And she puts into his hands a book. And then they part. Nothing is resolved. He goes to his hotel room and starts to read. And to his immense dismay, he discovers that he's reading a masterpiece. Dismay because he feels it would have been so much easier for him if she'd written a mediocre book. And he becomes her passionate reader really for the rest of his life. But nothing is really resolved about the ill feeling. And part of the thrust of this novel is to open up the idea that in life very few problems are ever solved. Either we forget or suppress, or we simply add the great experiences as well as the greatly bad experiences to our baggage, to who we are, what we carry through life. And although I don't write about this directly in the book, it stems from my certainty that one of the most terrible and deceptive words in the English language is closure. We don't, in movies and novels you get closure sometimes, but in life it rarely happens, if at all. So that's the background of Elisa, and she publishes many novels. He reads them all devotedly. He's always looking for himself in there, and he can never find himself. She seems to have eliminated him from the landscape of her imagination, until finally, when she's dying, he goes to see her about her last novel. He's furious because she makes him out, or the person he thinks is him, to have been physically abusive. He's not, and she gives him, with only a few weeks to live, she's had her right foot amputated. She's been a chain smoker all her life. She gives him a little lecture on how to read a novel.
So is it, you're famous for the research you have done for your previous books, or some of your previous books, and this one feels like there might be some more autobiography or autofiction.
There's loads of it. I mean, well, I don't know where to start. I mean, I've threaded, I suppose about a quarter of it is actually my life as truthfully as I could tell it, mostly from my childhood and the story of my parents. So my mother's first husband was away fighting in North Africa. In 1940, my mother met the man who would become my father one day. My mother at that time had 2 little children. My mother became pregnant, which would have been a scandalous matter in 1940 in this tiny village. It would have been the end of my father's career. He probably would have been court-martialed. To have an affair with the wife of a soldier serving at the front would be certain disgrace. So they put an ad in the local newspaper, home wanted for baby boy, 6 weeks old, complete surrender. And so my mother went with her sister on a train to a railway station, Reading railway station, and there she handed over this baby. And I only know all this because 60 years later that baby turned up in our lives. And that was the thread of my own life that I very much, or my parents' life that I very much wanted to include in this exploration of what character is in a whole life. This is really a very unresearched novel. All the global events that penetrate private lives, I wrote them as I remembered them, more or less. I got 1 or 2 things wrong, but people picked those up, they're easily corrected. But I did reach to a dusty old box I hadn't opened in a long time, and there was an envelope of old black and white photographs. And there's a picture I'd more or less forgotten of a very, very beautiful young woman, 24 years old, studio picture, almost certainly taken for her then husband to take with him to the front. A 2-year-old and a 4-year-old child sort of sitting close in beside her. She has long black hair, dressed in a rather modern way, a sort of white blouse that could have come from any time, or a white shirt. And she's looking into the camera with this very, very confident gaze, defiant. It was absolutely wonderful picture. And I realized looking at this picture that this was a woman I never met. She disappeared on Reading Station the day she gave that baby away. There was some sadness that hung over her life, not only sadness, but a kind of meekness and a nervousness about life that I never understood at the time. And she married a very domineering man, so that made things worse for her. So in some ways it was, I think picking out that photograph was my best bit of research. It was only 4 feet away under a table.
Yeah.
But otherwise, my ambition for this novel was to explore character. I've always been interested in character. I think it's our great inheritance from the 19th century, beginning with Jane Austen. Yes, beginning really with Northanger Abbey, it was 1802, 1803, right through to Flaubert and George Eliot and Tolstoy. The notion of character was rather challenged by the wonderful, great aesthetic revolution of modernism. Virginia Woolf famously said, "Character is dead," although she wrote a wonderful character in Mrs. Dalloway, I always thought. And it's hard to conceive novels today without characters, and yet the business of creating a character on the page is a fascinating, complicated matter. And I thought that if you could stay with that character through an entire lifetime, you'd have another angle on what character is and how it's buffeted by time, circumstance, and of course by accident. But I wanted to run the soundtrack through that life is not music, but global events. Suez Crisis, fall of the Berlin Wall, Chernobyl, 86, Cuba Missile Crisis, and so on, right the way through to the pandemic. So it runs roughly all the way from Roland's childhood till he's 73 years old. Not dead, but 73 years old. So that was the scheme of things into which every now and then I gave Roland some of my family, but our fates diverge when he's 16 completely.
Yeah. Yeah.
He lives the life that I think I would have lived had I not discovered writing for myself. I think I was very determined never to get a job. I'd been to the careers office and I'd seen those strange charts that showed the years down one side, and then down here your rising salary and then pension rights at 65. And to see a life on a page like that in a graph scared me. So I probably would have done what Roland did, live the marginal life. It's much mocked, but I mean, there are many people I think have very satisfying lives doing a bit of house cleaning. So Roland teaches tennis, does a tiny bit of inconsequential journalism for a listings magazine, and then as a person who's run away from his possibilities of becoming a concert pianist, he is in fact a precocious piano player. He ends up just for the rest of his life occasionally playing what's called munch music in a hotel lounge bar. I gather it's not called munch music here.
No, we don't have it.
People are munching crustless cucumber sandwiches, and someone's
Cocktail
playing
music.
My Way. You know, and you're, but Munch music, there are thousands of Munch music pianists.
Yeah.
And what dreams there are buried, one never knows.
Yeah. So, you mentioned sort of wanting to range over time. I mean, one of the things that I really admire about your work is the way that time is almost a character in and of itself. So, in Saturday, it takes place on a Saturday. You have a very sort of compressed time. In Atonement, it's in one historical era, but near the end, you sort of wrench us back to the present, and that works really quite well. It makes the whole novel work, actually. And here, you're hitting the major sort of moments of both the 20th century and our century so far with COVID and 9/11. I'm just curious about what sort of calculations you make when you're sitting down to sort of think about time as a framework for a novel. Is it a very different consideration when you have one day versus a whole century?
I remember at some point in this novel, I realized the time scheme was complex, but I wanted to make things not easy for the reader, but pleasurable, I hoped. So the chapters are long. Each chapter is somewhere between 12 and 15,000 words, which is probably 2 or 3 hours reading. So there isn't a disruptive time change. You're in one time era, but then you can go and live, as it were, in another.
Yeah.
And so crucial to the idea of writing a longer novel than I'd usually written was the idea of shape and architecture. And very early on, I thought that it was going to be in 3 parts. There'll be 4 chapters in each part, and each chapter will be that 12,000 plus. And then I'll be free within that architecture to move the reader around in ways that will be fairly coherent. Somewhere in my notebooks, in relation to time, I drew a sort of clock, and in the middle, I wrote the word Roland, and then round the clock, instead of numbers, I put characters, all the characters that were going to be in the book. And halfway between Roland and the time were all the locations. And then threading through them were all the events. It's not as if Roland is a sort of politico guy who's deeply involved in these events, except he is very much at the fall of the Berlin Wall. Yes, he's politically aware. He smuggles banned books into East Berlin before, in the 12 years before the wall fell. But these events, I think, shape our lives even if we haven't followed them. They nuance the feel of the times. So, for example, the first major event outside political event in Roland's life is the Suez Crisis. And I gave him an episode that only in the writing of the book did I realize how important it was to me. And it was a positive thing, that the British authorities, there was a military presence, there was an American military presence too, in Libya, a sort of leftover from the desert campaigns of the Second World War. When Colonel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, it was felt that Arab nationalism would rise up in Libya in sympathy, and British and American civilians were best to be guarded. And I was bundled off to an army camp on the edge of the desert. My father then became a very distant, busy figure with a service revolver strapped to his waist. My mother, by huge good fortune, was away in England, and I had the time of my life. For 10 days of unbelievable freedom, hanging out in machine gun nests with sandbags, tank workshops, dashing young officers who would like to take me for a spin on their Harley Davidson. It gave me such a thrill of the endless possibilities of freedom and of adventure. That might be another reason why I didn't ever wanted a job. That I sometimes wonder if that week or 10 days was instrumental in my becoming a writer, or just the sort of sense that one's life could be free, even though enormous amount of hard work is involved. So you don't have to understand these events for them to shape your life. And I thought really of how the Greek gods are and the Roman gods are in the Aeneid or in Homer, in the Odyssey. They are basically humans with all their faults, feet of clay, jealous, angry, dangerous, and I think they suggest to me something of our relationship to politicians, extremely powerful figures who we know are just also flawed human beings. But we have very little control. We might cast our votes and so on, but we have very little control over what's happening. And listening to Putin give that very sinister speech the other day about the possible deployment, we will use all our means, but Medvedev, his deputy, filled it out for us in case we were wondering. He's talking about nuclear weapons. But I thought, we have no control over this. And they do seem, and yet we know what flawed beings inevitably they are. They're not gods.
Well, this is an interesting thing. The coverage of this book that I've read has talked a lot about how Roland is passive. He's so passive. And
no, I don't understand that.
Yeah, I didn't really get that either, because you hit on these major events, Chernobyl, COVID. What is one person supposed to do, and what do we expect from the protagonist of a novel like this to go out and save the day or something?
Do you think it's because he doesn't shoot anyone or strangle anyone? I mean, that's sort of a demand, that you can't really be anyone in the contemporary world without at least throttling them and hiding the body and maybe getting away with it.
Or it says more about the reader, even a professional reader, like a book critic who.
Yeah. Well, if he's passive, we're all passive. I mean,
right.
He's not an exceptional person, but he still undertakes to educate himself for 10 years. He smuggles books to Berlin. When Chernobyl happens, his state of mind is somewhat unbalanced because his wife's just left him, but he seals up the house, even though the cloud's going the other way towards Wales, as it did. All of London was in a panic in those days. I went out and bought 400 bottles of water because we had a 6-month-old baby, and I knew that we have a lot of cows eating the grass and the milk comes quite fresh. But in fact, there was nothing to worry about. Well, there was lots to worry about, but basically where the cloud fell and the grass went radioactive, cesium-90 everywhere, was in a certain part of Wales, so those farmers just had to be compensated, and northwest Scotland. And we might be seeing that again. It's odd how these things come around again if the Russians continue to shell Zaporizhzhia or the other place.
Yeah. There's also something about gender going on, I think, in this criticism that Roland is so passive, because his wife does something very dramatic and very sudden, and she leaves him and her baby, and he is left to pick up the pieces and raise Lawrence. And when a woman does something like that, it's so evil. When a man does it, it's not really written about in the same way. So.
It's a thread that runs through the novel. The literary biographies are just stacked with men who leave their wives and children to go off and dedicate themselves to their art, and a younger woman usually as well. But you cannot mention the name Doris Lessing, for example.
Right.
That was, she left her. And I noticed that, in fact, Germaine Greer pointed this out years ago, that many of the great women painters had no children. It's the other way around it. So Roland finds himself in the position of the single mother, basically.
Yeah.
And that's why I include a whole section on Roland going to a lecture by an academic on the great American poet Robert Lowell, who left his first wife and went off to be with the woman who had become his second wife. But in the process, her love letters and her letters of anguish, this is Caroline Blackwood, he cut and pasted without asking her or even telling her finally when it was published into a volume called The Dolphin. And here's another irresolvable matter. The lecturer says, is The Dolphin a good volume? Is it a good book? He says, I think it's absolutely brilliant. Should Lowell have written it, put it together? No. You can't actually fix this. And all of us who love books must have sat in on, or love art of any kind, trying to square the difficult, irresolvable matter of great art sometimes being produced by terrible people. I mean, it's a wonderful conversation. It's an important conversation to keep having. If you acknowledge the art is great, I don't think you've got any... You might want to keep awareness of the life and just think that's an extraordinary puzzle. But you can't cancel great art. I mean, there's no way of doing it. It's out there, even if you approved of doing it.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's another one of those problems that never goes away, will never be resolved. Some awful people did write some good things. They're kind of anti-Semites, like Wagner wrote some of the most extraordinarily beautiful music, and so on. Another one of those, there's no closure on that one either.
Right. We're still wrestling with it. Okay, last question for me, so you all think of your questions. But there is a moment in this novel where you reference the Queen, who just died.
Me?
So I feel like that's an opening where I can ask about the Queen. But in 1959, you have Roland arriving in London from North Africa. And,
right.
Roland is used to eucalyptus trees in Africa and the intense sun and heat. And you write, but London's trees were rich and grand like the Queen, as permanent as the post boxes. And, it's this her permanence that has really been cited so much, and her stability. And we're getting a lot of hand-wringing type articles lately about, the looming fuel crisis, the economy in the UK, Brexit. People feel like if you really believe all these articles, then the Queen died and the UK is just falling apart. So I just wanted to sort of ask your take on that. I mean, what is the mood in the UK right now? Is it really as dire as it seems to be from the press that I've been reading?
Well, we've been in this very powerful ceremonial festival of glitter and horses and gilt and so on, and some genuine sorrow. It was such a media blitz that it was a holiday to come to a republic, even though the long-term prospects of your republic are also... You'll all be coming to England too. I think it's a very serious matter whether the republic survives. So, but not everyone is of one mind.
Right.
And the media tried to give this sort of very one-dimensional sense. 250,000 people queued to go past the coffin. Now that's a fraction of a nation of 67 million.
Right.
We didn't all queue. As for my own feelings about it, well, I have the oldest object I have on my shelf is a coronation mug that all school children got at the age of 5. in 1953 at the coronation. So, yes, she has been there. As a head of state, her function is largely symbolic. So the events, she's had very little influence on those events, but I think in people's minds it has been something to hold on to for a terrifically long period of time. But there came I mean, I know you've had your January 6th assault. We had a moment that only happened at the highest level, and it was very subdued. That is that the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for his own political purposes, which was Brexit, decided to dissolve Parliament. Now, we don't have a written constitution, but for the executive to dissolve Parliament, which is our sovereign body, it's our highest authority, was a fantastically disruptive and ignorant, foolish thing to do. He sent his people up to where the Queen was, in Balmoral in Scotland, because she's an unelected head of state. By convention, she has to do what the Prime Minister wants. Now, had she been the President of Germany or of the Republic of Ireland, Steinmeier and Higgins, and I'd like to think, had this been the United States, you could not simply dissolve the Parliament. I mean, it's only, well, maybe Elizabeth I could, but you have to go a long way back. Yeah. And by our glorious revolution, 1688, those powers were actually set in place. Parliament was sovereign. The Queen had no authority to say no. And that's when I felt, actually, I would like an elected head of state who had just that overlooking view on some of the basics that should be operable in a democracy. So it's nothing personal about any members of the royal family, but I just think in a complex modern world you need to stop when you get someone from the extreme left or extreme right doing something that is so against sense and and how power is distributed.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Who has
I was
a
very
question?
glad to step off into JFK.
Any questions for Ian? Okay. Right here.
The mic is coming to you.
Thank you. Just briefly, really, to start it off, why did you choose that particular section of the book? It's understandable why you didn't choose the other sections of the book which you'd read before, because it would have got a little boring, but for you. But why that part? Did you particularly like your skill in that part, or did you feel that it's really a relevant section?
No, I read it, as I said at the beginning, the business of contingency. I mean, how one's parents met, for example, how you became you. Your mum stayed in, or didn't stay in. She thought she'd stay in and wash her hair. Instead, she went to the dance. Or your dad was about to choose to go to that college, but chose that one. And a lot of people who go to college meet their spouses there. That matter of chance is, as I say, it's so commonplace, but it's an extraordinary miracle. The chances of you being you are, the ratio is just beyond calculation. And yet, novelists have to devise plots, so they impose themselves on this contingency, and that tension is always fascinating to me. So as I say, I wouldn't exist if Hitler hadn't invaded Poland, and etc., etc., etc. My father actually was in the Highland Light Infantry, all set to go and do a 10-year tour of duty in Egypt. But they were diverted to go and dig trenches in Belgium in 1939. So that's all. So then, if Roland had not done this and that, he wouldn't have been at this language class and then fall in love with, but it takes him 4 years to, he doesn't see her again for 4 years. But when he does, Slowly something develops between them. And then one of the major characters in the book, Lawrence, the 7-month-old baby, he exists. It fascinates me. Maybe it doesn't fascinate anyone else, but I just think it does. So that's the reason I read it. It's not only that I was tired of reading the opening pages.
I think we've got one over here in the corner.
Thank you. I'm fascinated too, actually. I think that's the what might have been. I think you've posited that in a few novels. One of my favourite novels of yours is On Chesil Beach, and the way you come up to that heartbreaking scene on the beach, and then if only he'd gone after her, and if he'd said this, and then the way you accelerate through the rest of it, it's just brilliant writing. Just magnificent, I thought, the way you did that. But my question's not about that. It's actually a bit of a populist question, but a number of your books have been made into films. And I accept that's probably a pretty lucrative thing, and that's, I'm not saying that's why you do it, but I'm interested in how you feel about that, because you often hear writers say they're my babies, they're my children, these books, how people care for them in the way they're treated. Whether you try to impose any conditions in the process, or is each film different, and your feelings about that whole process and afterwards.
Well, I enjoy the process. I mean, I generally write the screenplays, so I impose myself in that way. I'm generally too an executive producer, which at least gives me a say, but I don't expect anything more on casting and on other matters related before we get to shooting. It is a really odd process because you do play God in the novel. It's all yours. If you want it to rain, you make it rain. If you want someone run over by a trolley, but by a strange historical accident, and I mostly blame the French, the director is the auteur. It could have gone on the other way. It could have been the cameraman and the writer together. Could be gods. So you go from being God to being a kind of fallen angel. The screenplay writer is pretty low down, the process. And yet there's something both brilliantly exciting and unbelievably boring about a film set. Most film sets are sitting around waiting for the next setup to get set up. But when things are going well, and the dailies, the rushes are coming in, and things are suddenly coming to life, it's a great thrill. Having said all that, I've written a number of films. They've often taken up 2 or 3 years of my time. You make all kinds of very, very intense working friendships with people. You do press junkets where you speak to maybe 40 journalists in a day in Toronto or wherever the Venice Festival is. It comes out, it gets some nice reviews, and then it's gone in about a week. I mean, compare that somehow, I would say, compare that with books. They somehow hang on in there on the shelf. They have a sort of bit more of a life. And I know that streaming has changed all that and everything is available to us all the time. But still they die a cultural death very quickly. And some of the great favourite films that I loved 20 years ago, I watch them again and they make me blush. Books don't do that to me. Books still, when they're good, they sort of stay. Yeah, I know you can fall out of love with some books that you were passionate about in your teens, but on the whole, the books that you rate in your adult life tend to have, I think, a life. So I think a movie is going to be made of my novel about artificial intelligence. And I thought this time I'll just sort of stay involved in a remote way, like executive producer, have ideas that might not be listened to or not, see the script through various stages, but not write it, not be. So I've just done On Chesil Beach, just a few years ago, and the Children Act. Had wonderful time doing them, and they cease to exist. They don't. You can track them down.
One more question over here. Okay. Oh, okay, over here.
Sorry.
It's okay.
So since you mentioned On Chesil Beach, I actually just listened to your recording of it on Audible and the interview afterwards. And I want to compliment you on how extraordinarily well you write women. Because I identified very much with what the female character was experiencing when I was younger, this sort of intense fear and even repulsion at the idea of sex as it's presented to you in a very technical way in books, which of course is awful, and being made to feel like there was something wrong with her, and because you're other, because society, her friends had no problem with it, so she shouldn't have a problem with it, and so afraid and embarrassed to talk about it, and how painful that is. And I want to assure you that that is still a thing today. That will always be a thing as long as there are painfully sensitive people in the world. And in fact, in a society where sex is talked about as if it's nothing, it's even more difficult, I think, for people like that, because you feel like, well, you're just being silly and there's definitely something wrong with you. And I've never seen it presented so accurately, and it's just really appreciate that. That's very strange. It's a man writing this. How does he know? But a very good job with that. And
Well, thank you.
yes, thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
I agree that it still goes on. I think in some ways it might be harder. I think the internet and the availability of pornography for young boys has created incredible confusion. I thought it was bad enough in the late 50s, early 60s, when I was at boarding school, and practically everything we knew about sex came through dirty jokes. There was no other, and sly passing around of Lady Chatterley's lover, but that didn't help much. I'm not sure we've made a massive amount of progress on this, and I could easily cast, or I think of a young Muslim girl, or all kinds of people who live in environments where sex is barely discussed at all. I remember when my father, probably bullied by someone, thought he ought to give me a discussion, some instruction on sex. I must have been about 15. And my mother said very, in a very significant tone, she says, "Your dad's upstairs and he wants to talk to you." So I went upstairs and I thought, oh God, what's going to be up? And I found my father sitting on the edge of the bed, very interested in relacing a boot. and without looking up, he said, well, now you're 15, I think it's time, maybe we ought to talk about, and I said, no, we learn all that at school. And he said, oh, phew. And he said, right, fine. And that was it.
Well, we started the night with the Berlin Wall. We'll end it with sex. But Ian has signed a lot of books, and they are for sale from the library bookstore over here. We've been honored to have you at the Library of Congress. Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.